Okay, so have you ever wondered what exactly courage is?
It's one of those things everyone thinks they know you know.
Yeah, but then when you actually try to define it, it gets kind of slippery.
Totally. And that's actually exactly what we're going to be looking at today.
We're taking a deep dive into one of the all-time classics of philosophy, Laches by Plato.
Yeah, Plato gives us this amazing dialogue. Socrates, the OG philosopher, is talking with a couple Athenian generals.
And a couple of dads, too.
Oh, right. Can't forget the dads. This all starts with these two fathers, Lysimachus and Melesius. They want to know how to raise their sons to be courageous.
Yeah, I mean, imagine being a parent in ancient Athens. It was a pretty intense place.
Wars, political rivalries, you name it. So naturally, they wanted their kids to be able to handle whatever life threw at them.
So they take their question to the experts, right?
Exactly. They go to these two Athenian generals, Laches and Nicias, and of course they bump into Socrates, who always seems to be hanging around when there's a good philosophical debate to be had.
Always got to have Socrates in the mix.
And of course, he's going to make things interesting by poking and prodding at everyone's assumptions.
So what happens? How do they even start trying to define courage?
Well, Laches, the general, he jumps right in. He's like, courage, it's simple. Courage means holding your ground in battle no matter what.
Seems like a pretty straightforward military definition.
It does. But predictably, Socrates isn't quite satisfied.
I bet he's got some questions up his sleeve.
He does. He starts bringing up all these examples where just standing your ground doesn't really cut it. Like, what about the Scythians, those incredible horsemen?
They were known for fighting while retreating, right?
Exactly. They would harass their enemies, fire arrows, and then just disappear back into the steppes. Super effective, but not exactly standing their ground.
And I remember learning about the Spartans,
Oh, yeah. Great example. At the Battle of Plataea, they pretended to retreat.
but then they turned around and crushed the Persians.
Totally outmaneuvered them. So clearly there's more to courage than just stubbornly refusing to move.
I'm starting to see why they needed Socrates for this conversation.
Oh, yeah. And Socrates even pulls out some literary heavy hitters to make his point. He brings up the Iliad, by Homer.
Of course, the epic poem with all the Greek heroes.
Yeah, well, Socrates points out how even Aeneas, this legendary Trojan warrior, was praised for knowing when to attack and when to retreat.
So it's about choosing the right action at the right time.
That's what Socrates seems to be getting at, so Lares has to rethink things a bit.
So where does he go from there? Does he give up?
Not a chance. He tries a new definition. He says, okay, maybe courage is more about endurance, like toughness of the soul, being able to withstand anything.
Endurance.
Yeah, sounds pretty good, right? But of course, Socrates is ready with another challenge.
Let me guess he doesn't think that's quite right either.
He points out that just being stubborn, just enduring something, doesn't always mean it's courageous.
Sometimes you need to know when to quit, right?
Exactly. Like, imagine refusing to abandon a sinking ship when you could swim to safety. That's not courage, that's just foolish.
Yeah, that's a recipe for disaster.
So they both agree there has to be some wisdom involved in true endurance. It can't just be blind stubbornness.
So where does that leave them?
Well, luckily they have another expert on hand, Nicias, the other general, and he's got some interesting ideas about courage, too. He brings in the wisdom of this guy named Damon.
Damon. Not Matt Damon, right?
Haha, no, different Damon. Damon was a wise guy from back in the day, and he believed that courage is really about knowing what to fear and what not to fear.
Interesting. So it's not just about being fearless.
Right. It's about being smart, being discerning, knowing when to be cautious and when to be bold.
That makes a lot of sense.
And this is where things get really interesting. Nicias takes courage beyond just the battlefield. He says it applies to all parts of life, making decisions, facing challenges, all that stuff.
So it's not just for soldiers and heroes.
Nope. It's for everyone.
Wow. This is getting pretty deep.
It is. But Laches isn't convinced yet. He throws out a curveball. He says, hey, what about doctors? They know all about diseases and the dangers of illness, but that doesn't automatically make them courageous, does it?
Good point. Just knowing about danger isn't the same as being brave.
And that leads to this really key distinction that Nicias makes. He says, yeah, knowing about a danger isn't enough. You have to know whether it's better to face it or not. You have to understand both hope and fear.
So it's about making informed decisions.
Exactly. Weighing the risks and rewards, knowing when to act and when to hold back.
That sounds like a really tough balancing act.
It is. And Nicias goes even further. He says that sometimes death is actually preferable to life.
Wow. That's pretty intense.
It is. But he's saying that sometimes the most courageous choice is the hardest one. the one with the most potential for loss.
And that's something I think we can all relate to, those moments where we have to make a really difficult choice, knowing that there's no easy answer.
Absolutely. And of course, Socrates has to jump in here and stir things up a bit more.
Oh no, what does he do this time?
He throws out this kind of playful challenge to Nicias. He says, so if courage is about knowing what to fear and what not to fear, then wouldn't that mean soothsayers are the most courageous people around?
Soothsayers.
Yeah.
Like fortune tellers?
Exactly. Because they're supposed to be able to see the future, right? So they'd know exactly what to fear.
Oh, that's clever. So how does Nicias respond to that one?
Well, he clarifies his point a little bit. He says, look, soothsayers just predict the future. They don't necessarily know whether that future is worth facing or not.
I see. So it's not just about knowing what's coming, it's about knowing how to respond to it.
Right. It's about understanding the implications of what you know and then making a conscious, informed choice about how to act.
So true courage isn't about blindly rushing into danger.
Not at all. It's about carefully weighing your options, considering the potential consequences, and then choosing the path that aligns with your values and goals.
Okay, that makes sense. But then Socrates throws in another curveball, doesn't he?
He does. He points out that, based on Nicias' definition, even animals could be considered courageous.
Wait, animals? How does he get there?
He says, well, if courage is all about knowing what to be afraid of and what not to be afraid of, then wouldn't that mean even animals could be courageous?
Animals.
Yeah, because a lot of animals, they just, they react instinctively to threats, right?
Right, like fight or flight.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So Socrates like, hey, are you saying a charging bull is courageous?
Uh-huh. I can see why Socrates would ask that.
Yeah, but Nicias, he doesn't back down. He says, hold on, there's a difference between just being fearless and having what he calls thoughtful courage.
Thoughtful courage. I like that. What does he mean by that?
He means that true courage isn't just about instinct. It's about making a deliberate choice to face something difficult, even when you are afraid.
So it's about being aware of your fear, but not letting it control you.
Exactly. And Nicias thinks this kind of thoughtful courage is actually pretty rare, even among humans.
Which makes sense. It's easy to react impulsively, but to really think things through, weigh the risks and benefits, that's a whole other level.
It is. And this is where Nicias broadens things even further. He says that courage isn't just about war or physical danger. It's about facing any kind of challenge where there's potential for good and evil. So it's like making tough decisions, standing up for what you believe in, all that stuff.
So it's not just about being a warrior on the battlefield.
Nope. It's about being a warrior in everyday life.
I like that. So are they getting closer to a definition of courage? Have they cracked the code?
Well, Socrates, always the philosopher, points out a bit of a paradox here. He says, if courage is knowing all good and evil across all of time, wouldn't that make it the same as all virtue?
Wait, what? How does he get there?
He's saying that if courage is about knowing what's truly good and bad and then acting accordingly, wouldn't that encompass all of virtue? Like, wouldn't that mean courage is basically the same as being a perfectly good person?
I think I see what he's getting at. It's like, if you truly know what's good and bad, then you wouldn't ever make a bad choice.
Right. So he's kind of pushing Nicias to admit that maybe they haven't actually defined courage specifically. Maybe they've just described a really wise and virtuous person.
So even these brilliant minds couldn't pin down courage completely.
Nope. And I think that's kind of the point of Plato's dialogue. It's not about giving us a neat and tidy answer. It's about making us think, making us question our assumptions, and prompting us to keep searching for our own understanding of courage.
So it's like they're handing the question over to us. Like now it's our turn to try to figure it out.
Exactly. And I think that's what makes this dialogue so relevant, even thousands of years later. We're still asking these same questions about what it means to be courageous.
Totally.
Yeah.
Like we might not be facing down charging armies or sea monsters, but we all have our own battles to fight, right?
Absolutely. We have to make tough decisions, stand up for what we believe in, and sometimes just push through our own fear and self-doubt to do what we know is right.
So if courage isn't just about physical strength or battlefield heroics, then what is it about? What role do things like wisdom and experience play?
And how do we cultivate courage in ourselves and in future generations?
Right, like what can we learn from these ancient conversations about courage that can help us live more courageous lives today?
I think that's a great question to consider, and maybe one we can start to explore in our next part. So how do we even begin to answer that question about cultivating courage?
It feels like such a big one.
Yeah, how do we learn to make those tough choices when, We're not facing a literal battlefield.
Right. It's easy to admire the courage of, like, ancient warriors or something.
Totally. But what about the everyday stuff? What about the courage to have those hard conversations?
Or to stand up for what's right, even when everyone else is going along with something you know is wrong.
Exactly. That kind of moral courage, that's the stuff that really shapes our lives, right?
It does, and I think a lot of times we don't even think of those things as acts of courage.
We don't, but they absolutely are, because they often require us to go against the grain, to risk rejection or disapproval.
Or maybe even, to admit that we were wrong about something.
Oh, that's a big one. Admitting fault, changing your mind, those things take serious courage.
Yeah, especially in a world where everyone's always trying to be right, trying to win every argument.
It's true, and I think that's something that Plato's dialogue really highlights, this idea that true courage isn't about always being right. It's about being willing to question yourself, to be open to new ideas.
And maybe even to be wrong sometimes.
Exactly, and to learn from those mistakes and keep growing.
So maybe that's part of the answer right there.
Yeah.
The courage to keep learning and growing.
And to keep pushing ourselves outside of our comfort zones.
Because if we're not challenging ourselves, we're not facing those little fears, then how can we ever hope to face the bigger ones?
It's like training for a marathon.
You don't just show up and run 26 miles without any preparation.
Exactly. You got to build up to it little by little.
And I think it's the same with courage.
You got to start with those small acts of bravery.
Like speaking up when you see something unfair, or saying no to something that doesn't align with your values.
Or even just admitting that you need help with something.
All those things might seem small on the surface, but they build up over time.
They do. They help us develop that inner strength, that resilience that we need to face whatever challenges come our way.
So it's not about waiting for some grand, heroic moment.
It's about practicing courage in the everyday, in the mundane.
And I think that's a really empowering message,
Yeah.
Because it means that courage isn't something that's reserved for a select few. It's something that's accessible to all of us.
Absolutely. It's a choice we can make every single day.
So what are you going to do today to be a little bit braver?
That's a great question for all of us to consider.
I know I'm going to challenge myself to have that tough conversation I've been putting off.
I love it. And I'm going to try something new, even if it makes me a little nervous.
Awesome. See, we're already being courageous just by talking about it.
Uh-huh. That's true. But hey, even small steps count.
They do. And who knows, maybe those small steps will lead us to some pretty amazing places.
Maybe they'll even inspire others to be a little braver, too.
And that's really the power of this conversation, right? It's not just about us figuring out what courage is. It's about sharing those insights and encouraging others to join us on this journey.
Exactly. Because the world needs more courageous people now more than ever.
So let's all make a commitment to practice courage in our own lives and to inspire others to do the same.
And maybe, just maybe, we can make the world a little bit braver, one small act of courage at a time.
Well said. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive into the heart of courage, and we'll catch you next time for another exploration of ideas that matter.